So what's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Greetings to everybody. May peace and power elevation be to all the beautiful people out there. This your girl Tiffany coming through here live in effect. So as you can see, the title of the subject is going to be about the ghetto, which is up my alley. And the reason why I say it's up my alley because this is where we deal with sociology, right? We deal with sociology and you deal with anthropology on this one. Okay. I'm gonna tell you why I chose to speak on the concept about the ghetto, aka the hood, because it seemed like a lot of us, right? What I wouldn't say a lot. There are those of us in our communities, and those of our people who tend to forget that they loved ones came from these environments and had to work their way up to get them where they are today. We literally have people walking around here and condemning the people in the inner city community for the fact that they were brought up in the inner city. We have people that make condemnation saying that the folks in these particular areas don't want to do anything for themselves or not trying to get themselves out the hood, which is not necessarily true. All right. So if we look at the origin, and I can talk about this, so I'm gonna go ahead and freestyle it, and then I'll give you some sources that you guys can look up for yourselves. All right. Let's talk about the origin of the word ghetto. Okay. Now, what does the word ghetto mean? Actually, believe it or not, the word ghetto is an Italian word that means foundry. So, foundry is anything that consists of glass, metal, and plastic. Okay. Those are considered as foundry. And also means to cast away. To cast away means to throw away. So, these ghettos were used as a trash disposable area. That means that's where trash was thrown, right in the ghetto. Have you ever wondered, well, why there's so much trash in the community? Well, I mean, if you go back into the origin, that was the the intent, the purpose of having a ghetto is to use the area as a way to dispose trash. Okay, to throw away the foundries. All right. Now, once we get that out the way, let's look at who were one of the first people to live in these ghettos. Well, in 1516, one of the first ghettos was in Venice, Italy. Okay, Venice, Italy, and the people that was living in these communities, they were considered as minority, and those people were the Jewish people. The Jewish Italian people lived in these communities because they were considered as minorities. They were considered as the outcasts. This is where they had to live. They lived under these circumstances, under these conditions. Okay? They had to survive under these conditions. We talk about horrible conditions. All right, because they were considered as minorities. All right? Then we look at what took place in Germany. All right, so this was during the time of the Nazi period. When Adolf Hitler took over, right? So Adolf Hitler had a strong hatred for the Jews. Okay? He had such a strong hatred for the Jews. And the Jews weren't the only ones that he went after. He had strong hatreds for Catholic people, black people, just to name a few. Right? But he had a strong dislike for the Jews. So a lot of these Jewish people, they were sent off into the camp called the Ghetto, which is nothing more than the inner city. And they was forced to suffer under malnutrition. They were forced to suffer under malnutrition. They didn't have any resources available for them. If they died in the ghetto, well, then they just gonna die. And then some of them survived until it was time for them to be taken into the chambers and to be eliminated. Okay? Now, there were those who were able to escape the Holocaust and come to America. So the Jewish people that you hear about in America, you'll come to find out that a lot of them are descendant of those who had immigrated here because they were trying to get away from the Holocaust. Because there was so much hatred towards the Jews. So what we're looking at is the religious oppression. It wasn't really about racial oppression. It was more so about religious oppression. Because the Jewish people were looked at as a curse and looked down upon by other members in society. All right, so these people living under horrible conditions, they had to come here to America to survive and to live a better life. But guess what? When we look at American history about the ghettos, the Jews are not the biggest minority. Yeah, there was those of them that stayed in the hood. They had their own hood, and to this day, they still got their own hood. Right? You'll be surprised to find out that the Jewish people weren't the largest minorities. Guess who became the minority here in America when it came to the ghetto? Black people. Yeah. Black people made up a large percent. And why was that? Because of the fact that we didn't come through a Holocaust like the Jewish people had. We came from a descendant of those that were brought here to the Atlantic, and they was working against their own will. They was doing free laboring. And they were promised that they were going to get 40 acres and a mule, right? 40 acres of land. A lot of them didn't even get that. And when they were free, they couldn't find jobs. They couldn't go in certain areas. They couldn't live in certain areas. That's what you call the black code. Because the black code say, okay, yeah, you're free, but guess what? You're not allowed in certain territories. You're not allowed to come into this area. You're not allowed to work in this area. If we catch you in this area, then you're going to be sent back. If we catch you over here, you're going to be in jail. You're going to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And black people had it so hard, especially in the South. They had it so hard when it came down to living condition. Which is why many of them migrated up north because they figured that they would get better job opportunities and be able to raise a family, which they were able to. They were able to raise a family, but it wasn't as beautiful as they thought it was going to be because a lot of them weren't able to still live in the inner city. I mean, they weren't able to live in the suburbs. A lot of them weren't able to live in the suburb at the moment. Why? Because they were getting low paying jobs. So they had to sacrifice themselves in the hood, or what we call the ghetto. They had to manage it and make it livable for themselves and their families. They could not live in the suburbs because they weren't given that fortitude to do so. So when they thought they got away from racial discrimination, they encountered more racial discrimination. All right. So what I want to do is to back up some of the information that I'm saying. I'm going to use a little bit of source. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a source that you guys can look up for yourself. You guys can read into. Okay. So let's go ahead and, as a matter of fact, I want to give y'all this proverb. So it's an African proverb. And the African proverbs say that poverty is a form of slavery. Poverty is slavery because poor people don't have their will. Poverty is a form of slavery because you know why? You don't have enough leverage. You don't have the freedom. You don't have the fortitude. So when you living in poverty, right, that's what your suffering is. Just like slavery was a suffering thing, poverty is something that people suffer from as well. Now, if you make it out of poverty, it's like you done made it out of slavery. Again, if you made it out of poverty, it's like you made it out of slavery. All right? So I just want to give you guys that quote. And let's go ahead and look at some of these books that I would recommend to you guys. All right, so I found some books that I thought was going to be very helpful. Let me go ahead and post this book. All right. So right here, this book is called City and Race, America's New Black Ghetto. Again, you're going into the concept of dealing with sociology. So sociology deals with social interaction. Not only deal with social interaction, also deal with social class and social groups and etc. That's what sociology deals with. All right. So when you talk about the ghetto, you have entered the stage of sociology. You have entered the stage of anthropology because anthropology deals with the study of humanity. It deals with the culture of humanity. This is where cultural anthropology comes into play, which base actually falls under urban anthropology, which falls under cultural anthropology, right? And sociology, this type of sociology would be urban sociology, but I will get into that in a moment. So shout out to the chat. Hey, brother Brandon, how you doing? Big Cree Money, how you doing? Dash Sharab, how you doing? How y'all doing? How y'all doing? All right, so let's go ahead and let's get into this information here. All right, so as you can see, this title of the book right here is called "Cities and Race: America's New Black Ghetto." Right. All right, so it deals with the questionnaires and deals with the academic research on the inner city. Okay. Now, as you can see, let me go ahead and zoom this up for y'all a little bit so y'all can see that. All right, so you can see this one is dealing with the global black ghetto emergence, right? Which deals with the global community, global ghetto community. Also, this one deals with the part two deals with the current ghetto dynamics, and part three deals with the active black ghetto, right? And so, what I want to do is let's go down to the introduction. All right, so I'm gonna kind of skip the intro. Do something. Well, maybe not the intro. Let me go ahead and. All right, well, let's just try the rise of local ghetto. All right, so let's look at the rise of the local ghetto. All right, so right here, where I got it highlighted, watch this. It says, while people live and breathe in these rust belt cities and ghettos, the butte functionality imposed on them in capitalist America is difficult to refute. Keyword, capitalist. Just give that a thought. All right, it says a continuous tension between age-old urban adversities, those who drive to repetitively functionalize the city's physical and social order, and those who strive for livable, affordable communities, have been at the heart of defining urban form and social space. Right? So going down the hill, it says in this context, modern black ghettos in Rust Belt cities began in the 1920s and the 1930s with the Great Black Migration and the drive of urban elites to amass and control cheap labor, right? So booming industrialization in the Rust Belt and displacement of labor from southern farms compelled rural blacks to enter the northern Fordist industrial economy. So in 1910, 92% of blacks in America lived in the South. In 1950, 65% of this population lived in the North and East, right? Strongest initial magnets for these migrants were Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Baltimore, and Chicago. For example, Detroit's and Chicago's black population went from 6,000 to 44,000 respectively in 1910 to 120,000 and 235,000 respectively in 1940. So it says the creation of old or first generation ghettos in these cities, defined as poor black enclaves with 25,000 or more people before 1920, followed that built on pre 1910 migration streams of Southern blacks. And then what it goes on to say, when blacks moved into these ghettos, they were often surprised to find intense racism and discrimination. Okay? Southern whites' values about race they discovered were also prevalent in the North. For example, many restaurants and stores in Indianapolis, Chicago, and St. Louis refused to serve blacks. At the same time, parks, cemeteries, beaches, and hospitals were typically divided into white and colored sections, and unhealthy living conditions were the norm. Watch this. In Detroit, between 1920 and 1930, arrest rates for blacks were four times that for white. Blacks only 9.3% of the nation's total population in 1930 constitute 31.3% of the prison population. So in New York, Harlem between 1923 and 1927, the then youthful population had a death rate that was 42% higher than the city. This area's infant mortality rate, moreover, was 111 per 1,000 births compared to the city's 64 per 1,000. All right, and again, this was in between the 1920s and the 1950s, right? This was during that time where there was the Great Migration period. And what happened? These black people thought that they were going to go and live a better life, which some were able to, but a vast majority of them end up living in the ghetto because, come to their surprise, they realized that, oh, there's intense racism in the North. They thought they was going to get away from racism, but they couldn't. All right. So now I just want to show one more paragraph on here. All right, so let's go down to where they talk about the zoning. All right, so it says, but these 1940s ghetto were also constituted and reconstituted by key institutional practices. Two processes were crucial zoning and relative steering that were to hunt these cities thereafter. These classic institutional instruments of the 40s age came to the fore after 1930. Each helped to remake and piece together a new city, a robust industrial center, which applied state and capital power through embedded routines in a sense of efficient protocol. It its fulcrum was the use of technical experts, which was planners, builders, and realtors, and the de facto promise of civic assisting acts, however, always securing the legitimacy to continue these practices was unpredictable. All right. So not to go any further. Oh, well here it is. It talk about Atlanta. Well, let's look at what they was talking about in Atlanta. But before we go there, watch this. The zoning ordinance, not surprisingly, mapped out black ghettos for regulation. The usual recipe was to allow all kinds of land use, small lot size for new development, and use of any building materials. A scheme involved for managing these zones housing for the racialized poor would be provided. Poor blacks would live in their own worlds and not contaminate other housing submarkets, right? And their labor would be the burgeoning industry of the cities. Now, blacks disappeared behind walls, fencing a people off in everyday city life. So, city zoning as a whole confined activity spaces and determine physical forms in these neighborhoods that help engineer a marginalized population. Segregation and marginalization of the black poor in a strategic stroke emerged from the direct application of government resources and power. The interconnection of key things, space making, social engineering, and government largesse ultimately propelled this isolationist project forward throughout these years. Oh, and oh, check this out. Atlanta zoning ordinance more frankly embodies segregationist principles in this era. Residential areas were divided into three racial districts, all white, all black, and undetermined. It was officially illegal for blacks and whites to live in each other's districts. This intervention into land market dynamics received mixed reviews even from the growth and economic elite. Some opposed this mainly because of the unprecedented involvement of the public sector. Others in this sphere supported it, seeing a powerful apparatus to help mold a sense of orderly housing submarkets. At issue was the conflict desire to control the local state's police power, but to use government to produce and insinuate housing submarkets. This tension was ultimately resolved in anything but surprising way. Zoning was accepted as a planning tool, but amid stepped up oratory about the need to be watchful of and control government influence. As in other U.S. cities, zoning quickly captured and assumed the status of political normalcy. Spurred by this regulation, by 1950, Atlanta's most pernicious black ghetto, Techwood North Avenue, sprawled across its inner city. All right, so technically speaking, right, Techwood was considered as the first housing project to be built in America. And Techwood came about around the late 1930s. Right, it was the first housing project, the official housing project in the United States under uh, Franklin D. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Okay, so when Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the New Deal, right, to create public housing, which I will go more into in another video. All right, say what happened to be the first. All right, under his deal. Now there were other housing that came before, but they didn't last very long. All right, so that's that information. Now, and oh, again, the title of the book, if you want to know, I will type it in the comment section or I'll put it in the description link. It's called Cities and Race America's New Black Ghetto by David Wilson. That's the name of it. All right. So now let's go into another book. This book right here deals with the origin of the ghetto. All right, it's called Ghetto: The History of a Word by Daniel E. Swartz. Okay, I mean not Dan. I'm sorry, Daniel B. Swartz. Right, so the history of the word ghetto, and check this out. It goes into the introduction, the early history of the ghetto, right? The 19th century transformation of the ghetto comes to America, and the Nazi ghettos of the Holocaust, the ghetto in post-war America, right? So now let's go ahead and let's get into the introduction of this book. So go back and review what I was saying earlier, what it says. On March 29th, 1516, the Venetian Republic ordered that the Jews of Venice be restricted to a small island on the northern edge of the city. Christian inhabitants of this area were compelled to vacate their homes. All outward facing doors, windows, and walls on the island were to be bricked over, and gates were to be erected into place to be locked at sunset. Right? So it says the new Venetian enclave was hardly the first example in history of the Jewish street or Jewish quarter, which dated to the origins of the Jewish diaspora in antiquity. Nor was it the first instance in which the Jews of a European town or city were compelled to live in an enclosed area separately from Christians. Although segregation of this kind, especially in Italy, certainly grew more common in its wake. Yet the establishment of an enforced and exclusive residential space for the Jews of Venice was a historical beginning in at least one crucial respect. It marked the start of a fateful link between the idea of segregation and a particular word, ghetto. All right, watch this. While there are many theories concerning the etymology of ghetto, the most widely held trace it to the fact that Venetian island was already known as Ghetto Novio, which means new ghetto, before issuance of the 1516 edict that required Jews to relocate there. Ghetto is generally thought to derive from the Venetian verb gattere, meaning to throw or to cast. And that's what I mentioned to you guys before. That's why I mentioned to you guys before. The word ghetto means to what? To throw away or to cast. Because remember, the ghetto was used as a trash disposable area. But let's continue. Okay. Where did I stop at? All right. Anyways, so which would evoke the copper foundry that had one occupied the area that was to become an all Jewish district. From these origins, the word ghetto has journeyed a great distance. What started as the name for one specific place where Jews were forced to live became over the 16th century. Hmm. Now, as we go further down, it says later in the 19th century, as Jews throughout the West were emancipated and ghettos in their original form were dismantled, the word ghetto transcended in its Italian roots and was fashioned into a general metaphor for traditional and pre-modern Judaism, even as it also came to design new Jewish spaces from the voluntary immigrants neighborhoods of turn of the century London, New York, and Chicago to the hyper-segregated holding pens of Nazi-occupied Europe, right? And it says that were as dissimilar from the pre-emancipation ghettos as they were from each other, right? So later still, the word ghetto broke free of its Jewish origins entirely, emerging into the course of the last 70 years or so as a term more commonly associated with African American than with Jews. Okay? Again, and this came from chapter 1. Now, let's go and look at chapter 3. Let me do it like this. Okay, here it goes. All right, so chapter 3. Well, before I go to chapter 3, let's look at chapter 3. So the ghetto comes to America, right? And what does it say? One day in the 1880s, an inspiring author and recent Russian Jewish immigrant set out for the office of New York Sun with an article he had written in his pocket. His name was Abraham Kahan, and the article he was carrying was a set of vignettes of life in the Jewish quarter of New York. Summoning the courage to submit the article for consideration in person, he walked into the Lower Manhattan office of the Sun, a newspaper then at the peak of its reputation and influence, and was directed to the chief manuscript reader for the Sunday edition. We'll print this next Sunday, he told a delighted Kahan, encouraging him to bring him more such copy. But when Kahan was about to leave, the editor called him back. Pardon me, he said, you use a word about which I must ask. What is a ghetto? All right. So, as you can see, a Russian Jewish immigrant came to America, and he went to New York, and he wanted to write a story about the ghetto. Right? Okay, so I can't go any further down. Right, cool. All right, so down here it says, and this is a preview from this book. It says, recalling this episode in his memoir some 40 years later, when he had become a giant of Yiddish journalism as editor of the Ford and a renowned author of immigrant fiction, Kahan remembered thinking, was it possible for an educated man not to know the meaning of that word? A more charitable interpretation would be that the term ghetto was not yet part of the American lexicon by the 1920s. However, this unfamiliarity was a distant memory. Today, Kahan asserted confidently, every major American city has a Jewish quarter, and some of them as large as a city, and every American understands the meaning of the word ghetto. All right, so this is basically a preview, and if you guys want to get this book, it's called Ghetto: The History of the Word by Daniel B. Swartz. All right, so you guys can look into that. Okay, all right. Now, last but not least, there's another book here, and again, this is just a preview. Just a preview. This one's called African American Ghettos, and this is by Roland L. Warren. Okay. Now it goes into politics and the ghetto system. The ghetto as a social system, colonialism, conspiracy, and collective guilt, neighborhood autonomy, black power, and the revolutionary ferment. Right. Then, as you can see, there is 13 chapters in this book. Right. Now, I just want to go into chapter one. All right. Now, watch this. The politics and the ghetto system. It says if the ghettos are not impervious to social intervention techniques, they are at least highly persistent, showing remarkable ability to absorb or warn off attempts to change or at change. The papers in this volume contain many statements indicating the exceptional inadequacy of the concerted effort to date to do something about the ghetto, suggesting that much more massive programs must be implemented before basic change can be anticipated. Right? All right. So watch this. The ghetto as a social system. It is unwise as well as unnecessary to impute to the ghetto as a social system a sort of independent autonomous existing, deliberately perpetuating itself and feeding off all attempt at change. Similarly, it would be tend, tendinous or tendinous or however you say it, and exaggerate to consider the ghetto simply as the product of a deliberate conspiracy on the part of the power structure, white racism, the establishment, or other without social phenomena muster up as a scapegoat in a reductionist explanation of a highly complex situation. All right, so nevertheless, there is nevertheless much to support the desirability of looking at the ghetto as a system that perpetuates itself, deliberately or not, and whose relation to the surrounding environment are such as to support and reinforce this self-perpetuation. All right. And it says, to be sure, any social configuration which exists over a period of time can be thought of as self-perpetuating system, and any such configuration can be shown to be related to larger, more inclusive system in ways which support it and reinforce it. Yet, many social configurations are nevertheless transitory, although they may persist for a short or long time and are reinforced in its persisting through their relationships with their environment. Eventually, they tend to dissolve, but for the predictable future, the ghetto shows little sign of dissolving. In a sense, the question at issue is what set of circumstances or social policies or events could be expected to dissolve the ghetto rather than perpetuate them, and to dissolve them at a price which is acceptable within the broad scope of American democratic social values. One way of approaching this question is to look at the forces which perpetuate the ghetto configuration. Political processes and social policy, if they are to be relevant to an attack on the ghettos, must confront these forces and overcome them, or at least manipulate them in such fashion as to change the configuration. All right, so this book is kind of interesting, and I'm gonna tell you why I think this book is very interesting. Because what down here, where he says that similarly, it would be exaggerated to consider the ghetto simply as the product of a deliberate conspiracy on the part of the power structure and white racism and establishment, or other refined social phenomenon muster up as a scapegoat in a reductionist explanation of a highly complex situation. All right. Well, this is where I kind of disagree with the author at, because when he said that it's exaggerating, and I'm gonna explain why I disagree with that author. Again, you guys can look into his book, which is called Politics and African American Ghettos. So, this is where I have a disagreement with the author when he says an exaggeration to blame the concept on white racism and also the establishment, power structure, etc. That goes to show that this person is in denial about this, because when we look at the ghetto today, it was a white creation. And let's just be technical about that. It wasn't something that black people created. Black people did not make Black people did not take the initiative and say we want to go to the ghetto and we gonna make a place called the ghetto. Black people didn't say that. Black people didn't even know what the ghetto was until they got there. What black people wanted was a place to stay and be able to raise a family, and that was it. They was giving little opportunity to live um in a very what's the term that I'm looking for? In a very productive environment. Okay. Black people weren't given that opportunity to live in a productive environment. They had to make do what was available to them. All right. So when we look at our ancestors, right, they were pretty much forced into this situation. It wasn't something that they decided on their own will. They had to make it comfortable. They had to make it home until they could find another way out. And what I can't stand is people point the finger and blame people for the financial circumstances. With, not financial circumstances, but the fact that many of them come up in an environment where they have little to no resources without really understanding the bigger picture behind this. It's not something that folks just decide that this is what they want to do. It's a history that's taking place. So the ghetto, in a sense, is the white creation. And it's a form of white racism because white people wanted to see themselves as a dominant figure. They wanted to be the ones that was privileged in this country. They want to be the ones to have the power structure. And also, you got to look at the economic system of capitalism. And then what happens is, when we get into the concept about redlining, right? And basically, when you deal with redlining, what happens? You deal with the fact that these homes that are typically abandoned, or the land that is available in the area, they become affordable to those investors at a very cheap price. So these investors come into the community, they buy up the homes at a very cheap price, they buy up the land at a very cheap price, and what they'll do is they build businesses or apartment complex or condos and go up on the price, which would cause property taxes to go higher for those who already live in that area. And those who live in the areas, they have to move out. They have to move out and go elsewhere. So they're being forced out the community, economically speaking. They're being forced out because they do not have the economic resources to stay in those environments. So, see, and I can't stand when people try to use individualism as collectivism. See, there's a difference between individualism and collectivism. So, individually speaking, yes, there are those who are able to move out the areas and go live in a very productive environment and be able to raise their children. Then there were those who could not afford to move out. All right. Collectively speaking, when you see a grand scale of African Americans, right, they live, or African descended people, period, black people, they live in working class, lower class community. They live in working class and lower class community, right? Whereas a small percentage lives in the middle class or upper class community. And there's the politics with the upper class black folks. If you're not a part of that upper class community, or you're not within that circle or in that arena, you don't get to get your foot stepped in that door. They got their own little politics. And it's quite sad, but this is what happened when you deal with classism. This is what classism look like. It's almost equivalent to dealing with racism, except that it's black people doing it to black people. And then now let's get into the concept about politics, dealing with the voting era. So, people encourage folks to go out and vote and vote and vote, which is nothing wrong with that. But then the question becomes, what are you really voting for? And who can't you really trust that you put into office? Because at this point, it doesn't matter if you got a Democrat or Republican. The condition remains the same. The condition doesn't change much. The condition still remain a problem. So you hear the same story over and over again about what's going on in the inner city. Lack of jobs, school closing down, prison are being built, people being evicted out their homes, eminent domain. And for those of you that don't know what eminent domain is, that means that the government, what they'll do, they technically supposed to pay you to move out your house so they can put like a public facility in the area. So say if they want to build a highway, right? And there's like 6 houses over there in the area where they want to put the highway at. What they're supposed to do is tell the residents and give them the amount of time they have to move out of that area, right? And they're supposed to pay the residents to move out of those particular areas. Then that's when they proceed into the process of building highways, right? Or any public facility. Now, I'm going to put y'all on some game real quick. Here's a little trick. What people don't know is you can have an investor that already bought up the neighborhood, let's say 10 years prior to taking over. So these investors, they already come in, they sit down with the city councils and the mayor, etc. They have a dialogue, they talk about it, etc., whoopty whoop, and they already made their purchase. What they doing is they mapping it out and planning out what they're gonna put into those neighborhoods and how they're gonna go about getting rid of the people, getting people move up out the area. So what I'm saying is these people can buy up property 10 years prior or 15 years prior and you wouldn't know until the last minute. That's how clever this system is. That's how the capitalism works here in the United States. But we sit here, we have people in our community that blame our people for being in the environment they in the circumstances, and not knowing the history. Let me tell you something, black folks. You didn't ask to be in no ghetto, okay? You didn't ask to be in the hood. All right. This not something that just started last week. This not something that started yesterday or 2 years ago. This is something that's been passed on down from generation to generation. And you and people can sit here and argue that well there weren't folks that weren't trying to do anything to bring about betterment in the inner city, or they weren't trying to fight to make sure that these areas stay decent or whatnot. That's a lie. You'll be lying if you would make that argument. Because there are actually community activists that put up a fight for so long, and many of them put up the fight so much to the point that they end up becoming sick. They became so sick to where they were not focusing on their health. They were too busy focusing on community problems. See, people don't understand the pressure of dealing with activism. Activism is not like you can just go and be able to do something and then it's just supposed to be a quick fix type of thing. No, it takes a lot of dedication. It takes hard work to be able to put focus on what your passion is, especially when it comes to the people. Okay? It takes a lot of work, and it's nothing easy about it. You may end up losing your life, or you can lose your life as an activist. That's how serious activism is. You can lose your life. And I'm not talking about just health disparity wise, I'm talking about violence. I'm talking about violence. You end up going to jail or prison because of your community work. That's how risky it is to be an activist and be involved in doing community work, especially in the inner city. That is very risky. You're putting yourself on the line. And I know a few people personally, right, who have dedicated their lives to doing so much for the inner city community to the point that they did not focus on their health and they end up passing away. They end up passing away. They end up dying because they was going through health issues. And these people, they were regular people. They weren't folks that was from the middle class area. They weren't folks that was from the suburbs. They weren't living in no upper class community. These are average people that was living in working class community and the inner city. And they were putting so much dedication. And they did not have as much, but that with the little they had, they was trying to do what they can to help those in the community. And in return, there were people that came through for them, but a lot of people did not show them support. They didn't get a lot of help. So they end up dying penniless. They end up dying broke. There were these people had to get GoFundMe raised up for them just so they can have a proper funeral. What I'm saying is, with activism, you don't get paid for this. You don't make millions of dollars off of this, so you don't have. You can get off that Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson bandwagon, because those guys are not real activists. They are what you call counter-revolutionary people. People like them are counter-revolutionary. Tamika Mallory, whatever her name is, she's a counter-revolutionary. Black Lives Matter, they counter-revolutionary. So to do activism is really to put yourself at risk, put your life on the line. That's what activism look like. All right. But going back to my initial statement, our people have to really start studying about the inner city, about the urban community, why they are in the condition they are today, instead of bringing about condemnation on the people that's already there. And don't get me started with the ones that think that, oh, they got it made and they better than everybody else. Don't forget that your drug dealing daddy was selling dope, and that's how he lived in that neighborhood. Your mama was out there scamming folks, and that's how you end up in that neighborhood. Or let's talk about those who mama was on Section 8, getting Section 8 vouchers. And I'm going to talk about Section 8 vouchers in the next video. But they done got Section 8 vouchers and was able to live in the suburbs. And that, but ain't nobody ready to have that conversation, right? Ain't nobody ready to have that conversation how they mama got the vouchers and they was able to move into the suburbs. Anybody ready to have a conversation about how your grandmama and your granddaddy or your great grandmama and your great granddaddy was being antagonized and had picket signs sitting at their front door and white folks telling them that you cannot live in this community. You need to go back to where you belong, niggers. You're not welcome here, niggers. This is not your community. Get out of here. We don't want these black folks in our neighborhood. Or at the time, Negroes. We don't want these Negroes up in our neighborhood. They need to go somewhere else. They need to go where they belong. Y'all not ready to have those conversations. You're not really ready to really get down to the nitty gritty of all of this. Hmm. You're not. Because there's a lot of things that you have to unpack. But anyways, let's go ahead and let's look at what urban sociology is. Because I would advise you guys to look into urban sociology and urban anthropology. All right, so here it is. So, what is the definition of urban sociology? So, urban sociology is the sociological study of life and human interaction in the metropolitan areas. It is a normative discipline of sociology seeking to study the structures, the environmental process changes, and problem in an urban area, and by doing so, providing inputs for urban planning and policy making. In other words, it is the sociological studies of cities and their role in the development of society. Like most areas of sociology, urban sociology uses of statistical analysis, observation, and social theory interviews and other methods to study a range of topics, including migration, demographic trends, economics, poverty, race relation, and economic trends. Right? Urban sociology is one of the oldest subdisciplines of sociology dating back to the mid 19th century. Okay? All right, so that's urban sociology. So again, that deals with the social components, right, of the urban life, which in particularly deal with the inner city. All right. And a lot of times anybody that's in that field of urban sociology, they do what is called field research. And they do it through social experiment, meaning that they go out and interact with the people in the community, or they may disguise themselves as somebody that's in the area, right? Just to be able to make observation of what's going on and how people maneuver around, how people interact with each other, how people adapt into the environment they're living in. Okay, that's urban sociology. So you guys found out something new. Okay, so let's look at urban anthropology. So urban anthropology is pretty much similar to urban sociology, but there's a little difference. So urban anthropology is a subset of anthropology concerned with issues of urbanization, poverty, urban space, social relation, and neoliberalism. The field has become consolidated in the 1960s and the 1970s, right? All right, so it says urban anthropology is heavily influenced by sociology, especially the Chicago School of Urban Sociology. The traditional difference between sociology and anthropology was that the former was traditionally conceived as the study of civilized population, while anthropology was approached as the study of primitive population. There were, in addition, methodological differences between these two disciplines. Sociologists would normally study a large population sample, while anthropologists rely on fewer informants with deeper relation. Okay, so again, there is similarity, but there's only little differences. So urban anthropology will fall under cultural anthropology. All right, because there's four branches of anthropology: it's cultural, linguistic, biological, and archaeological. Right, and urban anthropology will fall under the category of cultural anthropology because you're dealing with the cultural aspect, right? And you deal with how people interact with each other culturally and how they be able to function in an environment or in a society. Okay, so again, urban anthropology will fall under cultural anthropology. All right. All right. So, anyways, you guys, that is it for this video segment. I will continue on because I have more to talk about. I want to get into the concept about the public housing projects, etc., and talk about how Black people done got into the suburbs. I mean, I elaborate a little bit on it, but I want to expound more on this. So, you guys stay tuned. With that being said, thank you guys for tuning in. Shout out to the people in the chat. I thank you guys for watching. And also, if you haven't done so, please make sure you like and subscribe to my channel. Hit the hit the notification bell, share the channel, etc. Okay. All right. So, for me, this is kind of like a very intriguing and deep topic because I always really wanted to touch on this, but I didn't have the time or opportunity to do so because I was focusing on other subject matters. But right here, this is up my alley because I went to school for sociology, so I pretty much understand this kind of stuff and be able to better explain this. But yes, we have to be able to get into the historical context of things and the events that have happened and taken place with us, especially as a people, as a race, and as a community. So that way we can be able to better educate our young people and be able to have an open mind and try to come up with better solution. Keyword try to. Okay. So I'm gonna say it once again, Black folks, it wasn't your fault that you lived in the ghetto. You didn't ask to be in the ghetto. It wasn't your fault. All right. The ghetto that you know here in America was the white man's creation. All right. It was to bring about power structure. Okay. And it was a form of a way to bring in some form of capitalism. All right. Oh, I want to mention this as well before I close out. A lot of the black genres, a lot of the black genres. When I talk about the genres, I'm talking about rap, R&B, jazz, blues, folk music. A lot of that came up out of the poverty-stricken community. A lot of that came up out of the inner city. All right. So all the black genres that you know, it came from the black inner cities. And what happened was when they got to the mainstream, the people on the higher level, right? The executive producers, the label, the record label owners, all these CEOs, they have found ways to make money off of these genres. They have found ways to control the genres. All right. So now the genres that we know, what that we once know, is no longer really owned by the people in those communities, but owned by those or ran by those who are at the higher level. Okay. So if you want to find, now you got the underground versions of all of these. You got the underground versions, but at the end of the day, Those who are in the underground level, they have a less chance of making it into the mainstream. But just know, all these black genres, they started in the heart of the ghetto. They started in the heart of the inner city. Okay, where black people were doing something to keep themselves entertained, to keep themselves focused while they were going through uh, economic disparities, while they were dealing with living under poor condition. Okay, they used music as a way to function, and they were able to bring various form of creativity to keep themselves functioning, to keep themselves focused. So, anyways, with that being said, you guys, that's all the information that I wanted to give y'all. So again, thank y'all so much. Y'all have a good one. Please be safe. Let's see if I got any commentaries on here. I personally have no problem giving African. All right, so there's no commentaries on my YouTube channel, so I'm assuming that everybody's good. All right, but again, thank y'all for tuning in, watching. Shout out to the chat. Y'all take it easy. Y'all take it easy on yourselves. Until next time, may peace and power elevation be to all of you. This your girl Tiffany. I'm logging off. Deuces. All right, be safe. All right, thank you.